Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 13 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to Go History, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard a sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, the crew of the HMS Resolution explored the wild southern coast of New Zealand and made first contact with the local inhabitants. On a rocky island, later named Indian Island, they encountered a lone man, armed but not aggressive. When Captain Cook approached unarmed and greeted him by pressing noses, the local custom, fear gave way to trust. The crew was welcomed into his world. His family appeared, and the next day, they were received in full ceremonial attire. The man's speech and gestures revealed dignity and intelligence. Despite a harsh dialect, his language bore striking similarities to Tahitian, confirming deep connections between Polynesian peoples. Their hospitality was remarkable, but so was their diet. Though they refused Cook's fish and ducks, signaling no shortage of food, their homes were poor and animals fared badly. The sheep brought from the Cape of Good Hope were wasting away. The rugged land with thorny plants and no soft pastures offered nothing for grazing. Still, the men thrived. With a steady diet of fresh fish, spruce beer, and wild herbs, their health improved. Cook's crew endured the rain and darkness of Dusky Bay, but they knew that, in this remote place, they had met people with culture, language, and kindness that spanned the Great Pacific.
Sunday, April 11th, 1773, Dusky Bay, New Zealand.
The clear and bright sky promised a fine day. This was especially welcome, as they had not been able to dry the sails and canvas since arriving in Dusky Bay due to the constant rain. Since the boats were needed elsewhere, they had themselves ferried across to a bay where they had first encountered an indigenous canoe. From a distance, they had also seen a waterfall, which had led to the bay being named Cascade Cove. At about 2.5 kilometers away, the waterfall did not seem particularly large. However, this was due to its high location. Once they arrived, they had to climb at least 180 meters up the mountain before they could see it fully. From there, the view was vast and impressive. The first thing that caught their eyes was a column of clear water, about 7 to 9 meters wide, plunging down a sheer rock face from a height of around 90 meters. About a quarter of the way down, the water struck a protruding ledge where the rock began to slope outward. From there, it cascaded in a transparent, roughly 23-meter-wide curtain over the smooth rock surface. As the water rushed downward, it began to foam, breaking against every jagged edge of the cliff before plunging into a basin below. This pool, roughly 55 meters in circumference, was enclosed on 3 sides by steep rock walls. At the front, large, irregularly tumbled boulders blocked the exit, forcing the water through narrow gaps. From there, it surged down the mountainside in a frothing torrent toward the sea. For more than 90 meters around, the air was filled with mist and spray, created by the force of the fall. The mist was so thick that within minutes, their clothes were as soaked as if they had stood in heavy rain. Despite this inconvenience, they did not let it deter them from admiring the spectacle from different angles. They climbed onto the highest rocks in front of the basin. From this vantage point, they could see a perfect circular rainbow in the mist of the cascade. At midday, when the sun was high, the rainbow appeared not just before them, but also below. Beyond and alongside this circle of light and color, The water mist shimmered with prismatic hues, though in reverse order. To the left of this magnificent scene, jagged brown cliffs rose sharply, their peaks crowned with overhanging bushes and trees. To the right, a pile of large stones lay stacked, seemingly heaped together by the force of water rushing down from the mountain. Beyond this, a sloping rock layer ascended about 45 meters, topped by a sheer 23-meter-high rock wall covered in greenery and bushes. Further to the right, clusters of broken rocks were shaded in various tones by moss, ferns, grass, and wildflowers. A stream flowed between these formations, flanked on both sides by trees standing around 12 meters tall. Their canopies shielded the water from the sun's rays. The roar of the waterfall was so intense, and its echoes rebounded so strongly from the surrounding cliffs that no other sound could be distinguished. The birds seemed to keep their distance, but further away, the piercing calls of thrushes, the deeper notes of the wattlebird, and the enchanting songs of various tree creepers filled the air. Their melodies completed the beauty of this wild and romantic landscape. When they turned their backs on the waterfall, the wide bay stretched out below. Small, densely wooded islands dotted the waters. Beyond them, on one side, the mainland rose, its towering snow-capped peaks reaching into the clouds. On the other, the vast ocean formed the distant horizon. The grandeur of this view was so awe-inspiring that words could not do justice to its majesty and beauty. Only the skilled brush of Mr. Hodges, the artist sent on this voyage, could capture such scenes with masterful precision. His paintings brought great honor to his talent and judgment, as well as to the taste and vision of his patrons.
William Hodges played a key role during Captain Cook's second voyage as the official expedition artist. Commissioned by the Admiralty, he was tasked with visually documenting the landscapes, peoples, and natural wonders encountered during the journey. His paintings offered Europeans their first glimpses of remote places like the Pacific Islands and New Zealand. One of Hodges' most striking works depicts the dramatic waterfalls of Dusky Sound in New Zealand, a place the crew explored in depth during their time in the region. I recently had the chance to see these original paintings at the National Maritime Museum in London. They capture the wild, untouched beauty of the area with remarkable atmosphere and detail. I have linked to the images in the show notes for this episode. Definitely worth a look.
After they had enjoyed this magnificent spectacle long enough, they turned their attention to the flowers that brightened the ground and the birds that sang so cheerfully around them. Nowhere else in the bay had they found nature so rich and beautiful in both plant and animal life as in this place. Perhaps the stronger refraction of sunlight against the steep rock walls and the sheltered location from storms made the climate here milder than in other areas. The soil itself was no better than elsewhere in the bay. As everywhere, it consisted of good, fertile earth. The rocks and stones around the cascade were partly granite masses and partly a type of yellowish, talc-like claystone, a common feature throughout New Zealand. In the evening they returned to the ship, highly satisfied with the day's discoveries. Upon their arrival, they were told that the indigenous family they had seen rowing into the bay in their finest attire that morning had cautiously approached the ship. Captain Cook had gone to meet them in a boat, but could not persuade them to come on board. He had to leave them to their own will. Before long, they settled in a small bay near theirs, directly across from the ship. They sat on the shore, close enough to be heard and spoken to. The captain had the fife and bagpipes played, accompanied by drumming, but this did not draw them closer. They seemed indifferent to the music and paid just as little attention to the drumming. Since nothing could entice them to come aboard, several officers and sailors rowed over to them. The locals received them with a sincere and friendly manner. However, all attempts to communicate through gestures failed, as neither side could make themselves clearly understood to the other. The girl initially showed a particular interest and boldness toward a young sailor. From her behavior, she seemed to mistake him for someone of her own gender. However, whether he later took inappropriate liberties, or if she had another reason for her displeasure, remained unknown. What was clear was that she no longer allowed him to come near her. As the indigenous people were still at the same spot near the ship upon their return, they also went ashore to meet them. The man gestured for them to sit beside him and repeatedly pointed at their boats moving between the ship and the shore, as if he desired one for himself. Since they could not grant him this, they made no particular effort to determine if that was indeed his intent. After some time, the locals lit a fire about 100 paces from their water supply and prepared fish for their evening meal. They remained there throughout the night. This display of complete trust in them was greatly appreciated. That evening, a group of officers, planning a hunting expedition the next day, left in a small boat toward the northern side of the bay. They intended to spend the night there and be ready at first light.
Monday, April 12th, 1773, Dusky Bay, New Zealand.
The next morning, Captain Cook had a boat crewed and set off with Georg's father toward the mouth of the bay to chart the nearby cliffs and islands. On the southeast side of the island, where they had first anchored, therefore called Anchor Island, they found a small, charming bay and a pleasant stream. They stopped at its bank to enjoy a second breakfast with some crabs they had brought along. In honor of this meal, the bay was named Luncheon Cove. After this short refreshment, they continued their journey to the outer islands and found many fur seals on the cliffs. They shot 14 of them and brought them on board. They could have easily hunted more if they had been able to land on all the cliffs, but the surf made that impossible. The seals in this bay were all of the kind known as fur seals, first discovered and described by Professor Steller on Bering Island near Kamchatka. They were thus found both in the northern and southern hemispheres. They were common at the southern tips of America and Africa, as well as around New Zealand and Van Diemen's Land.
Van Diemen's Land was the original European name for the island of Tasmania, located south of mainland Australia. It was named in 1642 by Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who called it after Anthony van Diemen, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies at the time. The island remained known as Van Diemen's Land for over 200 years, particularly during its period as a British penal colony in the 19th century. In 1856, to shed its grim association with convict life, the name was officially changed to Tasmania in honor of its discoverer.
The only difference between those in Dusky Bay and those in Kamchatka lay in size, as the ones here were smaller. During this hunt, it became clear that these animals led a very harsh life. Some, though badly wounded, still managed to escape into the sea, even though they had lost so much blood that both rocks and water were stained with it. They were not particularly useful for the table, as the meat was almost entirely black and inedible. However, the heart and liver could be eaten. The heart, with strong appetite and a bit of imagination, could be mistaken for beef. The liver tasted exactly like calf offal. But all fat had to be carefully removed before cooking, otherwise the taste was unbearably oily. The captain made good use of this. He had oil boiled from the fat to use as lamp fuel and kept the skins carefully, as they were useful for patching rigging. The lucky catch of the previous day prompted him to undertake another trip to the Seal Islands, and Georg's father accompanied him, just like the day before. But today, the sea worked against them. The waves were so high that it was impossible to approach the rocks, let alone land on them. With great effort, they made their way around the southwestern tip of Anchor Island, but conditions were even worse there. The waves crashed toward them with such force and towered so high that even the sailors got seasick. Still, the captain didn't let himself be stopped. He insisted on rowing all the way to the northern coast of the island and along it to chart the positions of several headlands. It was lucky they took that route. The small boat that some officers had used for hunting on the evening of the 11th had broken free in the rough weather and was drifting straight toward a rock where it would have been smashed if the captain's boat hadn't arrived just in time to catch it. They immediately brought it to safety in a small cove and the sailors compensated themselves with the food supplies that were still in the officer's boat. After a quick meal, the captain headed to the place where he believed the officers must have been stranded. Between 7 and 8 p.m., they reached the bay and found their hunters on a small island, but they couldn't get to them since it was low tide and the water wasn't deep enough. They had to land on a nearby headland and, given the late hour, accept that they'd spend the night there. With much effort, they managed to start a fire, grilled some fish, and after their meal lay down to sleep, rather uncomfortably, since the rocky shore was their bed and the sky their blanket. At 3 a.m., once the tide had risen enough, they set off and brought the officers back from that desolate island, where they had been stranded after their boat had drifted away. They returned to the cove where the boat had been left the day before. There, in the rainy and windy weather, they found an endless number of storm-petrels of the bluish kind, common throughout the Southern Ocean. Some were flying around, but others were tucked between tree roots in the forest, in burrows or rock crevices, where they were hard to reach and apparently had their nests and chicks. These could be heard along the mountainside, making various cries, some with a sharp, piercing voice, others with a croaking tone like frogs. Georg remembered that, on another occasion, they had found countless burrows on the top of one of the Seal Islands, and they had heard young storm-petrels in them too. But those burrows were all connected, and the chicks could crawl from one to the other, making it impossible to catch them. During the day, none of the adult birds could be seen, as they were out at sea gathering food. They had been seen flying out in the morning and returning in the evening, probably to feed their young. Since they usually returned from their excursions around that time, they often saw them flying around and nearby. Because of the dusk, they had long been mistaken for bats. These birds had wide beaks and a dark stripe over their wings and bodies, but they were not as large as the common puffins or Manx petrels found in European waters. The instinct of these animals, to dig holes in the ground for their chicks, to roam across the entire ocean in search of food, and then to find their way back to the coast from hundreds of kilometers away, was truly remarkable. After the group spent a few moments observing them, the officers climbed into their recovered boat and returned to the ship with the captain. By 7 in the morning, they arrived at the ship, quite exhausted after their restless night. The Māori had probably anticipated the bad weather that day. At least they had left the spot near the ship where they had camped the previous night and returned to their homes on Indian Island.
Thursday, April 15th, 1773, Dusky Bay, New Zealand.
In the morning, the weather cleared up a little. The captain set out again to continue mapping the northwestern side of the bay. They joined some officers who planned to spend the night in a bay on shore. On the way, they passed the fishing boat that went out every morning to supply the whole ship with lunch. They were quite surprised to see the young black dog in it, the one that had run away on the 2nd. The men said that at daybreak, when they were near the shore, they had heard a pitiful howling from the nearest headland. When they looked over, the dog came running toward them and immediately jumped into the boat as they approached. Even though he had been in the forest for 14 days, he was not starved at all. In fact, he looked healthy and had a shiny coat. He had probably survived by feeding on a large species of rail, which they called water hens, and which they often encountered in that part of New Zealand. He might also have eaten sea mussels or dead fish that the ocean washed up. If there were carnivorous animals in New Zealand, then based on the abundance of such food, especially if they were as clever at hunting as foxes or cats, they would certainly have been very numerous. In that case, such animals would either not have escaped notice by the many parties they had sent into various areas, or they would have been known to the local inhabitants. And the latter would certainly have used the pelts of such animals for clothing in this damp and harsh climate, instead of relying, as they actually did, solely on dog and bird skins. They themselves had, from the first moment of their arrival, paid the greatest attention to finding out whether there were any wild four-footed animals in New Zealand, but they found no trace. One of their men, who could not imagine that such a large land would lack new and unknown animals, claimed to have seen a brown creature twice. It had been about the size of a small jackal or fox and was sitting on a tree stump near their tents at dawn, but had run off as he approached. However, since no one else saw it, it seemed likely he had been mistaken in the dim light. He had probably taken one of the brown-colored water hens, which often crept under the bushes, or one of their cats, usually found chasing birds, for a new 4-footed animal. After they heard the story of the dog from the fishermen, they continued sailing and entered a bay where they encountered a large number of ducks of 4 different species. They shot several of each kind. One species was as large as an eider duck and had exceptionally beautiful plumage, dark brown with white speckles. The body and tail were iron gray. The wings had a white shield-shaped spot, while the flight and tail feathers were black, and the middle feathers green. Another species was about the size of a mallard, but completely light brown. Each feather had a yellowish-white border, and a stripe of the same color appeared on the sides of the head and around the eyebrows. They found the iris of the eye beautifully yellow, and the wings showed a shiny blue-green patch bordered by black lines. The third species was a bluish-gray whistling duck, about the size of a widgeon, with a membranous structure on both sides of the bill to help suck in sea worms, its main food, usually found in the mud left by the receding tide. Its breast was speckled with iron-gray feathers, and there was a large white patch on the wings. The fourth and most common species was a small brown duck, almost identical to the English gadwall. After they had explored all the nearby bays and caught or shot enough fish and ducks for dinner, everyone hurried to the agreed meeting place. They arrived shortly before nightfall and pitched a kind of tent made from sails and oars. Their appetite was so good that they weren't picky about cooking, and their fish, prepared completely, à l'indienne, on wooden skewers over a large fire, tasted excellent. After the meal and a drink of spruce beer, of which they had brought a small barrel, they lay down to rest. Certainly not as comfortable as in their beds, but they made it through the night.
This concludes part 13 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of James Cook. I have linked a map of the locations of this episode in the show notes. For those who would like to see the locations of the journey around the world on the present day, I recommend my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go. There, I visit the places from Georg Forster's travel narrative and try to uncover traces and connections between today and the past. So that was episode 13 of our journey around the world with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the HMS Resolution, on which we will continue our travels together in the coming weeks. I hope we can travel a little further together, because life is a journey. Being part of it is everything.